Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening, or the middle of the night. I don't know. Whenever you might be watching this, welcome to C3, West Michigan's inclusive spiritual community. We're a values-based spiritual community in Grand Haven, Michigan. Although right now we're sort of global, like everybody else, meeting online in this, in this strange format of which I am really grateful. I mean, in the middle of some challenging economic times and a global pandemic, it's amazing that we can relate in this way. And I want to thank you for being a part of C3. Thanks for supporting C3. Those of you who do, thanks for watching these teachings. Thanks for coming to Talk Back, which immediately follows this every single week. It's really nice to have your voices and discuss what you heard and what questions you may have on the teaching. So I'm feeling grateful. And we're already looking forward to when we might be able to get back together again. Very tentative date is something like around the 1st of May. That's a kind of hopeful possibility at this point. And how we will get back together, we'll get back together in the flesh in Grand Haven. But we're going to continue doing this online. How we're going to work that out, we're still in process. But we think the online connection has been really life-giving to so many people and also to us. So we want to find a way to do both at the same time. Yeah, let's get together physically and let's continue to have an online presence. So don't forget the other stuff that goes on around here. Sign up for our newsletter. Very easy. Go to our website, c3westmichigan.org, and sign up for the newsletter. Make sure you stay for the musician each week. Check out our weekly meditations given by someone in the community. 2 to 5 minutes of their thoughts of what's going on. So it's a way of widening the circle of voices. And of course, we have a lot of interesting guests, which you can find by going back on our Facebook page or on YouTube, or by signing up for our newsletter. Look for old teachings. So that was I guess a little intro. I'm finishing a month now on the word sorrow. I'm in a teaching series called Meaning Matters, where we take a different word each month and try to turn it over, try to work with it and let it work us. And this month, we've been talking about sorrow, and my contribution, I tried to say two things so far. I wanted to talk a bit about the stages of grief, or the stages of sorrow. The 5 stages, or 6, some might say. You could check that out, teaching out, if you want. And I also tried to say in that teaching that sorrow itself is sacred. It touches what it means to be a conscious human being. It touches human consciousness. We're aware of our impermanence, and sorrow keeps us in contact with that. And though it hurts, it touches something very precious. That's what I tried to say in week 1. And in fact, today I want to pick up again on that theme. Week 2, I tried to say something about ritual and ceremony. And I personally think the soul starves for ritual and ceremony. The ego, I think, who we think we are, just the surface self, the small self, is skeptical of things like ritual and ceremony, and rightfully so. Sometimes they can be very rote and rigid and not have much depth. But the soul, I think, is the part of us that is deep and nuanced and multifaceted and rooted somewhere. And ritual gives it a chance to breathe. Like, what about being a human being in our depths? And ritual, particularly around grief and sorrow, I think is really important. And I'd like to add, especially in as religion, for many people, at least traditional religion, isn't the center of gravity so much in people's lives. I mean, maybe it is for some. It depends, of course, on what we mean by religion, but let's just be kind of general for a moment. As religious rituals and rites and times of year don't take center stage, and that's, even if you claim to be religious, that's probably true because the market is the thing that's shaping our year. Think about even the major holidays are shopping events now. So anyway, my main point is, as it starts to wane as center stage, I think our hunger for ritual and ceremony grows because it is a loss, even if you're not religious or you don't believe certain tenets of your own religious tradition or faith. It's I don't know. I guess my main point is we're still hungry for ceremony. And it's because it's a way of saying life is precious. And so I think in the 21st century, it's a kind of a challenge. What are our rituals around grief and sorrow? And in the talk back last week, which was very moving, all of a sudden the conversation turned toward funerals and ceremony around funerals. And it was a very rich and meaningful conversation because that kind of stuff matters. So today, I want to talk about something I hinted at in week one, but I want to go into a little more detail. What is the relationship between sorrow and joy? Because I'd like to suggest they're holding hands somehow. They're two sides of the same coin. They're two dimensions of a paradox. And I'd like to say something even more directly here at the beginning, that one of the ways I think about human beings is through a word like capacity. Like, human beings have the capacity. They have the capacity for astonishingly bad behavior. That's true. Like, really bad behavior. And I say all human beings have an astonishing capacity for bad behavior. And we have an astonishing capacity for beauty, for love, for forgiveness, for grace, for joy, for sorrow. We have these capacities. And the scary thing about them is that they're big. I mean, think about exuberant joy or the depths of despair. Those are actually, they're a little frightening to the ego, to our small self. It's like, oh God, what if I get taken down, Or even joy can be like that. What if I spiral out of control and embarrass myself, So these capacities have a kind of vitality and a kind of life that, my opinion, is that the more whole we become, and I don't mean perfect, I just mean more like I live my life in widening circles that move out across the world. That's Rilke. As I collect up more and more of who I am and round out more and more of these capacities, I think that's living a full life. You're probably familiar with the line from Jesus, I have come that they may have life to the full, or the fullest. I love that phrase, by the way, because he doesn't explain it. I know, you can read a bunch of theologians that might explain it, but I just like it in its most direct sense. What is it like to live a full life? And I'd like to suggest really feeling sorrow and really feeling joy, which hold hands. And I want to read a poem here at the beginning. I don't think today's talk is going to be all that long. Of course, I always think that. So I'll try to keep it within range. I want to read a poem that I read the first week by one of my favorite poets, Yehuda Amichai, and it's a poem called A Quiet Joy. And I'm going to read it. I'm going to make a few comments. Maybe I'll read it again at the end. I'm not sure. But I want to invite you to listen for something. It's a poem about joy, but it begins with a feeling and an experience of longing and loss and sorrow. And he seems to be saying something like, just touching that longing and that loss, just for a moment. And it opens the poet, it feels like it opens the capacity within the poet to experience what he calls a quiet joy, the quiet joy of just sitting on a park bench. So here's the poem. A quiet joy. I'm standing in a place where I once loved. The rain is falling. The rain is my home. I think words of longing, a landscape out to the very edge of what's possible. I remember you waving your hand as if wiping mist from the window pane, and your face as if enlarged from an old blurred photo. Once I committed a terrible wrong to myself and others, but the world is beautifully made for doing good and for resting like a park bench. And late in life, I discovered a quiet joy, like a serious disease that's discovered too late. Just a little time left now for quiet joy. I suppose it's also a poem about aging and what happens to us as we age, as we grow older, as we realize both the beauty and the wrongs that we've done and the losses that we've experienced. And interestingly enough, the invitation, the capacity for a quiet joy, just resting, starts to bloom, we could say. And again, so there's something about this paradox, sorrow and joy, holding hands, touching somewhere mysteriously. And I love paradox. It's one of the words we'll be exploring in future months, so hang in there. And I love paradox because it takes us out of the way where we often talk about what it means to be human. Here are things that I've been complaining about for a while. We talk about how we're wired, how we're programmed. We talk about our hardware, our software. In other words, we use mechanistic and computer rooted metaphors for what it means to be human. And I suppose there's a place for that, but a paradox, speaking in paradoxes, is not very computer-like. So I prefer that. I prefer to say our capacity for joy and our capacity for sorrow are the same thing, or are holding hands. So let me just take a look at my notes for a second and see what I have time to cover. I want to come back to something I was suggesting a few moments ago, is that big emotions like sorrow, like grief, and like exuberant joy, or even a quiet joy, full-bodied emotions, they're a little frightening to one part of us. Another part of us loves it, revels in it. It's like, finally, I'm alive. Even if I'm sad, I'm alive, you know? And probably some of that reaction, wanting to stand at arm's length, you know, some of it we could blame on the Enlightenment in general, you know, this ultra worship of the rational. And the rational is amazing. I'm like a huge fan of the rational. We wouldn't have a vaccine without it. So, but it's 25%. I made that number up. But it's like 25% of being human. What about the other 75%? So one part of us wants to keep sorrow and even joy at arm's length. And maybe it has to do with something very old from childhood. Like as children, when we experience something difficult, a trauma, a betrayal, confusion, you know, something that we cannot yet handle physically or psychologically, the two most common responses are a feeling of abandonment, like I'm going to be abandoned, or I am abandoned, or overwhelmment, like I'm going to be flooded and overwhelmed. And these are very old. They're both psychological and physiological responses to challenging environments. And it comes up again with things like sorrow and with joy. We might get flooded, we might get overwhelmed, or if I allow myself to say yes to this, I'll be abandoned. So, these are old, I was going to say coping strategies. That might not be the best way of putting it, but they're old patterns. And so it actually takes a lot of courage. This is my main point. It takes a lot of courage to say yes to the what's happening emotionally, and even physically, because emotions, of course, are in the body. They're not just thoughts. In fact, they're almost definitely not thoughts. They're housed in the body, so they might contain a certain amount of energy. So it takes tremendous courage to say yes to them. And something happens, and that's kind of what's happening in this poem, I think, is that as he allows himself to feel the longing, to see the old face, to see again the wave that he'll never see again, instead of being overwhelmed or abandoned or cast, to the rocks or something, he's drawn deeper. And just beneath the surface of that initial touch of sorrow, the quiet joy opens. And isn't that the mystery of being human? That we're not just one thing, we're more than one thing. And I don't know if you've ever been to, I'm sure you have, a funeral of someone you love, and almost always, especially at a good funeral, especially if you're Irish like I am, somebody cracks a joke. And you could say, they're trying to, they're avoiding grief. I say, no, they're grieving, because laughter and tears are so related. Anything really beautiful can make you cry. And any real loss, you remember the joy. And that's part of what makes it so precious and so painful at the same time. So maybe just as a little aside here, a 1 minute aside, I think elders archetypally have something to teach us in this respect. They can teach us how to grieve, how to touch sorrow and joy at the same time. They've lived long enough, like he's talking about in the poem. I have just a little time left now for a quiet joy, he says. This is part of the role of the elder, to teach us how to touch the big emotions of life, how to savor them, how to, when an old person is grieving, telling stories of love and loss and beauty and joy at the same time, it opens us. It's like, oh, that's right. I'm going through something, but that's not all there is. And look, this person has gone through it before me. I think that's why it's particularly painful, with so many deaths in the United States and around the world, it's particularly painful that we're not together in the grieving process. If you've lost a friend or a family member or a colleague or a parent or a grandparent, or just anyone that you were close with because of COVID. And talk about a great human loss, because in being together, speaking of ceremony, what I'm describing, even the role of the elder, helping us touch both the joy and the sadness. And all of a sudden, I just remembered in the ancient world, all over the ancient world, and probably in other parts of society and cultures that I'm unaware of, they had professional mourners, which is hilarious. I mean, it's beautiful and hilarious at the same time. Do you get a business card with that? But it tells us something. Having a professional mourner at the funeral means that sometimes as human beings, we're blocked. We don't know. That's what shock is. We're just blocked. And that's okay. And the professional mourners will do it for us. They'll teach us how to smile and laugh and cry. And that's what in part what I'm saying about the role of the elder, giving us a little window on the fullness of life's offerings. So the final thing I want to say actually has to do with Zen Buddhism. So in Japanese, there's a word for what I'm describing, and I'm going to try to pronounce it, but I don't know any Japanese, and I'm totally impoverished when it comes to Asian languages, period. So here's the best attempt at the word. Mano no aware, something like that. It's a Japanese word. And it means the sadness of things beautiful. The sadness of things beautiful. And that's what I'm talking about. The sadness of things beautiful. And it needs a whole word just to describe the paradox. And there it is in Japanese. And in Zen Buddhism, this is a very important notion. It's a very important paradox. And it's particularly poignant during the Cherry Blossom Festival. What's interesting about Japanese culture, the little that I know, is that they don't have 4 seasons. They have many, many seasons. And one of the seasons is about 2 weeks long. And it's the cherry blossom season. It's not a festival. It's not something within something larger. It's something in and of itself that has at its very center the word that I'm describing. The paradox of something, of the sadness of things beautiful. Because the thing with the cherry blossom is that it only lasts 2 weeks. That's it. That's it. It's the full blossoming of something. And the moment it's here, you also feel the sadness of it going. It's already releasing its petals. They're already falling to the ground the moment they're present. It's like experiencing something that you cannot cling to, which is why in Buddhism, we're reminded that everything is impermanent. And instead of that being devastating, it's beautiful. It's paradoxically beautiful. It's both sad and joyful. So the question we might ask ourselves here is, what if I give myself more fully to both the sorrows and the joys? Because I imagine that, well, I don't imagine, I know it also works in reverse order. It's like, those of you who have children or get to be around young people from time to time, sometimes their exuberance just with life itself, discovering, mastering something, and a tear, all of a sudden arrives. Like, what is that? That's the word. That's mano no aware. That's that Japanese word for the sadness of things beautiful. So the question is, what if I gave myself more fully to these things? What if I allowed myself to feel the joys and allowed myself to feel the sorrows? What would happen just beneath the surface? How would I feel more whole, collecting up more and more of what it means to be human in the world? And how might that serve the world in a larger capacity? So maybe one final thought here, especially for those of you who live in Grand Haven. One of the interesting things that happens year-round, summer, winter, fall, spring, the 2-week Cherry Blossom Festival, is that people gather on the beach to watch the sunset. Why? Why? It's just a moment. Well, I would like to suggest, consciously or unconsciously, they're gathering for the sadness of things beautiful. That this is amazing. And why would you go back, by the way? Because, hey, you've seen one sunset. I got the photo, good to go. But no, it's like it lures us, it draws us. It's like a lover in a way, saying return to the sadness of things beautiful. It's both at the same time. It's something is ending, and that's also beautiful. And maybe it's something like, and something will rise in its place, meaning the sun. It's both. It's like the sadness of things beautiful. So maybe next time you're standing at the sunset, don't worry so much about putting it on Facebook, but drop into what's happening on the emotional level, on the body level. Allowing yourself to feel what it feels. See if you can feel the fine line between sorrow and joy. So that's as much as I have for you today. Maybe I'll read the poem one more time from Yehuda Amichai. A quiet joy. I'm standing in a place where I once loved. I'm standing in a place where I once loved. The rain is falling. The rain is my home. I think words of longing, a landscape. I think words of longing, a landscape out to the very edge of what's possible. I remember you waving your hand as if wiping mist from the window pane, and your face as if enlarged from an old blurred photo. Once I committed a terrible wrong to myself and others, but the world is beautifully made for doing good and for resting, like a park bench. And late in life, I discovered a quiet joy, like a serious disease that's discovered too late. Just a little time left now for quiet joy. Wishing you all the very best this week. Stay safe. And I really look forward to seeing some of you in person in the near future. Peace.